Welcome to Classical Chats. I'm Tiffany. Today we have Ross, who is an electrical engineering student, PhD student, in UC San Diego. And we have him today because he used to play the flute and the piano. He still plays the piano actually. But what's really fascinating is that he has been doing these projects involved with machine learning and how to make better technologies for musicians to play together, but also in advancing the possibility of music making through machine learning. So, hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello.
Hi, very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. I'm gonna add in that I really love your background, even though
Excellent.
it's not fake. Clearly, because I can
Not at all. Yeah, you might see my cat walk
see
around at
the
some point.
that's so nice. I can see the wind blowing the weeds behind you. So
Yes,
thank you for your time.
of course.
So let's start from the very, very beginning.
Oh
How
boy.
did you get started in classical music,
I think
or
that's.
music in general?
I think my classical start has got to be back in fourth grade when they did the petting zoo of all the instruments at the elementary school, and they said, pick the one you want to play. And I said, the flute looks good because the teacher demoed the Rugrats theme song, and I wasn't allowed to watch Rugrats. So I'm like, oh, I gotta pick the flute. That's the rebel instrument. And from
The
there,
rebel.
yeah,
That's
I
unusual.
yeah, I loved it so much. I just stuck with it through high school, through college, and in middle school started playing the piano, and really never looked back since. And love every minute of music I can make.
Why did you start the piano?
I that was a gift from my great grandparents. Said they really wanted us great grandkids to learn the piano, so they sent a little bit of money to my parents and said, please go find a piano. And so thank you, Costco. We ended up with a piano in our house, and it's so much fun to play and also to make a little bit of a ruckus in the house when things are too quiet.
Mm, yes, it has that ability to really shake things up. But were your family members musicians or?
No, I mean, my mom played a little bit of clarinet in middle school and high school, I think, but really wasn't a musician beyond that. My dad played a little guitar, but yeah, I wouldn't say we had a really musical family from the get-go. It was just kind of things that we learned in school and came to appreciate and love.
But then you eventually decided on electrical engineering. How did that
Yeah,
happen?
conflictedly,
Very different.
because by the end of high school, that's when we're starting to kind of put ourselves into little boxes for what major we want to end up in, and it's really hard to go against. There's so much mainstream current going towards, oh, engineering is a great safe career, and it's an exciting subject too. It's fascinating. It's how the world works, and so of course you want to study that. But at the same time, there's this whole musical life you have that you've been told is an extracurricular through all of high school, and it's something you do outside of your main studies. And then you you have to make this decision so early on before you have the time to explore either. So I chose this the mainstream engineering for my college time and kept doing music kind of sidelined but next to it. And it wasn't until grad school I realized, oh, they both go together and they both have you can do things that combine both and really learn more about each discipline from the other one.
Do you think it helps you to understand music? Just because people ask me all the time. I studied philosophy in college, and people are always like, "So, did it help you understand music?" And it's always a very strange question. But
Oh,
I don't know.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, so there's this course that I TA for in the summer, taught by a great professor named Shlomo Dubnov, all about music and machine learning. And
Mm,
it's so interesting because these students come that have these great computer science backgrounds, and then when it comes time for something as simple as understanding a major scale for to understand how to represent music, that's a 3 week learning process for them. Then they really haven't internalized it. But you take any musician, put them in the class, they know exactly what you're talking about, and they can understand what it means to provide music as input to a machine learning model. So it's really interesting how the two
mm,
inform each other. And another thing that is kind of not thought about enough. So in machine learning, you have things called generative models, where you're trying to create something new from experiences or data you have in the past. And I think musicians
right.
really understand quickly what it means to improvise on something or to do something in the style of something else. And it's again something that it
Well,
helps.
musicians. musicians with like creative brains because I can't
Yeah.
improvise. But yes, keep going.
Yeah. No, exactly. There's a creative aspect to the math and to the machine learning that it's good to have trained that part of your brain to be able to think creatively to approach problems.
Mm, interesting. Do you have certain very memorable musical performances? Because I heard from someone on at classical, together with classical, that you were in marching band, you were conducting, also you were so involved
I
in
think
so many musical endeavors.
memorable is the right word. Yes. I would say the what would be my top experience. I think the we always joke in our marching band now. We have this name drop that everyone throws in every conversation that we were in Super Bowl 50, which I think is a memorable highlight because granted we were not the superstars. I think that was Beyonce, Bruno Mars, Coldplay's job, but we were there on the field, and to see this whole production happening around you and to be a small part of it, it was so exciting. And it's something we watch on the TV every year, and then to be on the other side of the camera was really exciting. And
That
apart,
must be so exhausting.
yeah, it was a very very fun event for everyone. And I think personally, one of my favorite moments I've had so far, the very first conducting masterclass I went to, back I was just getting started and really didn't have my foot on the ground yet. And I went to Vienna, and on day 2 of this masterclass,
What?
the maestro Carlos Tricolidis, he pulls out this recording and he goes, "This is the craziest thing I've ever heard," and it's Ben Zander with his orchestra in Boston doing Beethoven 9, and he's going through it at a
Mm,
tempo faster than anyone has ever heard before, and he's making this argument in his CD that the tempo we read from Beethoven isn't what Beethoven intended. And the whole purpose of the masterclass I was at was to understand the authentic performance of Beethoven symphonies. And so he says, this guy, Ben Zander,
mm,
he's the expert. He got it right, in this maestro's opinion. Fast forward now to
mm.
2019, and now I'm in Aruba studying with Ben Zander. And this is someone who now, for a few years, I've been looking up to and told from my first experience that this is someone you should pay attention to and listen to. And I'll get to study with him for a week, and it was really musically life changing to get to listen to someone so positive and encouraging, and also learn great musical ideas from.
I can imagine, but hold on. So you started on the flute, then you went to the piano. Somewhere in between, you decided to also conduct.
I
Walk me
think
through that.
I think we missed part of my story here. Yeah. So back in undergrad, about my second year of college, I decided I was missing music a little bit too much, and so I started taking the music major courses, and
Mm, fun.
that was also the same year I joined the marching band. I started year 1. I'm like, I'm going to study and be a great engineer, and then I went, no, I miss I miss playing the flute. I miss interacting with people. I miss all these things, and so I started to ramp up my music life again. And uh, by my third year of college, I was within the marching band, joining the crews of people that conduct performances, and really loving it, but also feeling like there's got to be a little bit more of a technical aspect to it, because this is really it's great. It's students teaching students how to carry through performances, but I felt like I wanted some guidance from a teacher too. So I started taking some conducting courses at college, and then I realized, oh, this is actually really really fun. I get to interact with people. I get to help facilitate performances and help bring out people's musical ideas. I want to do more of this, and I knew from the start I'm not good at this yet, but I really really want to work on this because this is a fun thing to do, and this is um, just so rewarding to get to see people light up when you're in front of them. And so after college
That's very
ended,
inspiring because it really shows. Sorry, it really shows that you're so interested and passionate about classical music and music. Just it constantly is motivating you to keep playing, even
yeah,
though
yeah,
you're not pursuing music.
definitely. And yeah, it's really been an interesting learning experience, because after college I realized I have so much to learn if I want to keep doing this, and to what it is about conducting, you're asking, if you're in front of an orchestra of 60, you're asking 60 people for their time and their attention and their energy. And to be deserving of that, you really need to put in a lot of work on your end to make sure you're providing something back of value and creating together. Because otherwise, you don't want to have 60 eyes on you and then not have anything to give back to them. It's a sad situation. So that's why I said I want to go study. I want to go study in different places. I want to study with different people. I want to figure out what it is that can help me be the best to give myself then to the performers and let us all interact together. And so that's what's motivated beyond college,
Yeah.
going to these master classes and workshops and meeting these great people.
So how do you keep on having that musical experience during your very busy, I imagine very busy PhD studies and your schedule in the academic world? How do
It's
you
definitely
balance the
been,
two?
yeah, it's been tricky because there's never enough time to practice either fully as much as one would want to. And so what's been nice for me, my college marching band director and professor, he told me at one point, he was showing me some people. He's like, look, this person does physics and music, and he was trying to say like, look, there's a chance to do both, and that's what's really come out for me this year, which has been great. Working with Professor Dubnov, I've been able to do some projects that tie together. You need an understanding of music, and you can help build tools that help classical musicians, and so that's been a great enjoyment for me, that I'm able to kind of practice studying my art without doing my art for a little bit of time, and do it from the perspective of an electrical engineer. And if I can dive into
Okay,
one
I have to
example,
ask.
yes.
Yeah, keep
So
keep on talking. Sorry, there's like a lag
excellent.
where I don't know like when you're finishing your sentence. Sorry, so keep
No, I
going.
get
I
it.
didn't
I
mean
just hate to
to
cut you
interrupt
off
you.
mid-question. No, one example. This latest project that was kind of inspired by the beginning of COVID and how do we facilitate these musical interactions on digital space. We took a look at Zoom performances, and we asked among this research team, why are these Zoom performances so bad? And of course, we have this lag that we just experienced ourselves, right, where we're talking at the wrong time. But beyond that, there was something huge missing, which is none of the musicians could actually interact with each other. If you're in a room with 8 other people, and if I want to look at Tiffany, I can look straight at my camera and hope she understands I'm looking at her. But also, all the other participants in the room think I'm looking at them now. And if I'm actually looking at Tiffany, it looks like I'm looking, some random angle on the screen. So we said, how do we give a little bit of that nonverbal communication back? Because as a pianist, I'm sure anytime you've played with an orchestra, every little gesture, breath you do, it's cueing someone, it's telling someone where you are in the music. And we wanted a way to
Yeah.
add that back. So we used machine learning to train some models so that a computer could understand who I'm looking at and then tell the person who I'm looking at. And so that was a really fun project. And I think someone who hasn't played with an orchestra or played with someone wouldn't immediately go, this is what's missing from our Zoom performances. So it was great to have that informed experience.
Yeah, I completely understand the concept, but walk me through the actual thing of how it works. I think Victoria wrote teaching performance arts online, adding gestures and nonverbal communication to virtual classroom. So how does it work for those who don't know? And also, I didn't get a chance to watch the video beforehand, but does that involve a special camera or how does it work?
So that's the coolest part. It's the same camera that we all have on our laptops right now. And all we're doing is we're taking in the camera, and we've written software that is built off thousands of images of me and some other research participants. We would practice looking at particular parts of our screen. And the camera now knows to recognize, okay, if I see Ross's face and it's in this side at this position, he must be looking here relative to the camera. And then it reads your screen while you're playing, and it says, okay, on Tiffany's Zoom call, that's the location of Victoria. And then from that, it just that's a machine learning magic at play. It will then provide, in the case of ours, it broadcasts the name that Ross is looking at Tiffany right now.
Okay.
And there's some really cool technology in the works right now from some other companies and our research team too, where we're trying to take it one step further. We're trying to say, what if instead of putting Tiffany in bright red letters, what if for Tiffany's the video she sees, what if it shows my eyes corrected there automatically? If it makes a new image with my face looking towards Tiffany, um,
But not for other participants, I guess,
but
in the
not for other
orchestra.
participants, and that's another thing that's why it's so hard to do, right? That's now 9 different video
Yeah,
feeds we have to coordinate. But it's
yeah.
such an exciting
Also,
area of
that
research.
yeah. Wow, that's so cool. I mean, it's a bit scary. I immediately remember those meme posts that I see where they try to change the facial expressions of old paintings. And so I
Hmm.
imagine how this would kind of be very strange because then you experience this is a philosophical problem also because then what is the identity of that person? Because to the next violinist next to me, for example, in an orchestra, they're not getting the same experience, right?
You're
So
exactly right.
of you, let's say you're the conductor, so then that wow, that really complicates things. That really means that you can split your personality.
Yeah, and I was reading some research papers from the other groups who are working on this, and
Mm.
one thing that the reason they won't give their model fully to the public right now is they have some what they call catastrophic failures, where suddenly my eyeball might be over here and my mouth is over here, and you don't want to send someone that picture ever, right? You want to make sure that it's at least a semblance of a person on the screen. So you're so right.
Yeah.
There are things that can go wrong, and philosophically, you don't want to send a false impression of someone.
How many years do you think it will take for us to reach that
You know,
non-catastrophic phase?
I- I'll be honest. I think this is within the year. This is a really close research effort that
Mm.
that a few different people are making, and COVID has, for better or for worse, expedited this kind of virtual presence research effort. Now, the question I always have is this going to be done once the pandemic has reached a more stable period when we're finally back to gathering in person? Because I think that's the ideal situation, is that we can play together in the same physical space. But no reason to stop developing the
Mm.
technology. I just hope we can outpace
Right.
the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a definite challenge that I understand. But you know, as someone who has performed a few live stream concerts, what I enjoyed through this technology is that I can play for the entire world at the same time. So
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
wonder if that might be benefit to this kind of AI research and just how you incorporate technology into music and yeah, developing new technologies.
Yeah, it's so great that we've had the chance to explore these areas, because I think without this unfortunate prompting by everyone being locked in their room for a few months, we wouldn't have had this chance to explore, okay, how do we actually communicate with people? What I'm going to come into rooms now with a huge appreciation for just nodding to someone, or pointing to someone. I haven't done that for a year now, and you're right. We haven't had this chance to explore great broadcasts and how we can reach people through a camera and a microphone.
Mm. So let's shift gears a little bit. I mean,
Of
I don't
course.
know actually if your other machine learning projects are related to the pandemic, but I see three more things here that uh, my assistant Victoria has written down here. There's Beethoven.
Yes,
Listen to
Beethoven is what we'd like to call him here. It, it's a portmanteau of robot and Beethoven, or Beethoven.
I get it. Okay, so explain to me. There, that's one of three. So what is the Beethoven? Was it inspired by the anniversary of Beethoven last year, or what is this?
I'd say it was more coincident, and we were lucky to have Beethoven with the name so close to bot. That was really where that came from.
Hmm.
Um, and and there was one other thing in that made it nice, which was our sampled music we used for the project was the Ode to Joy, and so of course we have to throw Beethoven's name in there. But the
Of
goal of this
course.
project was to actually study human-computer interaction, or human-robot interaction in this case. Um, how do robots fit into physical spaces that humans are in? Now, obviously, we don't have robots in concert halls quite yet, but that hasn't stopped a few researchers from putting in a robot conductor who waves its arms, or
Well, yeah, you mentioned no robots in concert halls. Technically, no, but then like this is not a sponsored podcast by
go
Steinway,
for
but
it.
Steinway, um, and also other piano brands, they develop self-playing piano technology, right? So
Yes.
in a way, kind of they can exist. I think there have been performances with self-playing piano in concert halls, but
Oh,
that's not exactly a robot the way that we understand the visual aspect of what a robot looks like, which is resembling a human. But keep going.
yes, robot pianos. So I would definitely say that those pianos that we see that play themselves, those are robotics, because you can see something physically moving versus a computer where there's no moving parts that are visible to us. And maybe it's not the arm we'd expect to see or the face, but it's still definitely in the category of robotics. And it's actually what we used for Beethoven. It was a self-playing piano. Um,
Ah,
mhm. And yeah, so I guess I've never had the fortune of seeing one in concert yet, just in solo concerts in hotel lobby or in a showroom. But that's definitely probably the closest we have to a robot playing a concert for us right now. And the goal of our study was to say, how do musicians interact when there's a robot in this hierarchical setting that is the orchestra? Because as a musician, we're trained to listen to the players around us. We're trained to look at the conductor, and we need to synthesize that information and make a decision. When I hear this violin player just a little bit out of sync with what my impression is from the conductor, do I have to take my sound and match my violin player, or do I match what the conductor is asking for and then hope that the violin player next to me follows along? So we were trying to question, if we throw a robot in the mix of all this that's already complicated enough to navigate, what decisions will people make in the face of a robot? So we would have the robot play, we would have someone conduct, and we would have someone play. And the robot, depending on which mode we had turned on, would either be trying to follow the conductor, and this is again, we use machine learning to follow the conductor's hand and figure out where their beat was, so that the robot could have an informed performance. We also had the robot listening to the player, and so sometimes the robot would play when the conductor was cueing, sometimes it would play when the violin or cello was playing, and sometimes it would try to combine both. And then we'd ask the participants after, when did you feel like you were heard or being observed? And compared the results to what the robot's actual intent was. It was really, really interesting to learn about what people say they would do in those situations and what they actually do. Because so many said that, of course, I would follow the conductor, and then they played along with the musician instead. Or they said, oh, I would always use my ear, never the conductor, and then suddenly they're following the conductor instead of listening. And it's so exciting.
mm, lie detector. But
Yeah,
wait, so how do you train the musicality in robots? Because the issue that comes up immediately when you talk about how do you make musical choices of who to follow, some of it depends also on your understanding of something like rubato. You know, the flexibility in timing and in phrasing. How do you put that into an algorithm? I don't know anything about machine learning.
I
How do you put that into a AI understandable piece of knowledge?
I have bad news because I think you just opened up three topics I'd love to talk about for an
Oh,
hour. So I'm going to try to condense
fascinating. No,
the
this is
best I can.
fascinating. It's
So
more interesting. Earlier today, I saw an article about how robots are trying to learn how to ask someone else on a date. Like that's
yeah,
not very interesting. Like it's quite uh, a failure at the moment with some of the things that it's able to say. But like music, though, it's so much more complicated. I mean, I'm sure language is also very complicated, and how do you listen to the emotional reactions of the person that you're talking to for a robot? But music, it's not so defined.
yeah, you're
So,
absolutely right. And this is something that actually affects the machine learning side of activities like composition. So,
mm,
and machine improvisation. There are great labs. Another that comes to mind is Gil Weinberg's at Georgia Tech, where he's teaching robots to be improvising performers in jazz ensembles. So he has Simone, this marimba player, but it's a robot. It has a face, it has arms, and it will play the marimba along with a pianist, a bass player, a saxophone, and it's great. Anyone listening to this should look up Simone, the robot marimba player, and listen because it's real. The interesting thing is, when we're talking about generative models, something a mathematical model that creates something. How do we say what good music is? How do we say, oh, that was in the style of Beethoven? we call that defining a metric in the machine learning space. How do we measure how well our model performs? But how do you do that with something as aesthetic and personal as music? How do you say that's good music, that's bad music? So that's
Mhm.
an open problem in the area. When you have this model create output, you can have humans evaluate it, but that's not really what we want to do. We want to have it automatic. Um, so this is an open question, really, for anyone who's interested in the space. What features would you look for in musical output that would help tell you, oh, that was a correct musical output or an incorrect musical output? And maybe
Yeah.
this is a question for the philosophers, right?
Well, I mean, it's a constant problem, even just in general, subjective aspect of music playing. It's like in music competitions, right?
Hmm.
Why does one get a vote for playing better than the other? What is it?
Yeah,
And you can try to nail down to certain things like, oh, okay, better phrasing and with more emotions or better dynamic control. Just things are very technical that don't really sum up what makes a good performance of music. So I don't know. How do you see it going forward with the machine learning?
you
This
know,
aspect of subjectiveness.
yeah, it's funny that you brought up judges and competitions because to some extent, I'm sure some might like, okay, can we get one robotic judge up there who rates the consistently, with every performance? And I'm going to say on the converse of that, though, with these machine learning problems, we usually end up bringing in human judges, and we ask them to rate things and evaluate them, and then we try to normalize their scores the best we can. But yeah, it's a great question. I don't have the answer to it. I don't know how to say something is good or bad or stylistically correct, and it's a great problem for us to think about. And it's not, there are other problems in machine learning. Can you detect a person walking across the street? That's a yes or no question. But with music, you're beyond yes or no. It's really so much subjective matter.
Mm. Does that relate to another music learning project that I see here on my cheat sheet system to assist telematic? What is
Yeah. So
telematic
telematic
performances?
performances. That's back to our first topic, really, of that nonverbal communication. How do we
Ah,
play with each other online? Yeah. So we've done some fun experiments with something called sound painting. It's a compositional language created by the composer Walter Thompson. And
mm,
the idea here is that the conductor is less of a facilitator of beats as he is a manager of an improvisation among the group. So he'll give something like some symbols like, hey, whole group, play a long tone. And that is now subject to 13 interpretations from the 13 musicians. Not everyone's going to choose the same note, they're not going to play it the same way. But at the same time, the conductor might say, okay, now a short tone or play with a minimalist style, and he sends all these cues to the musicians to adapt to improvise off together. And so that was really uh, our highest point of this nonverbal communication project. We said, what if we tried it in a classroom and tried to do sound painting with it? And that was when we got to see when the conductor would say, okay, I want you to play um, a duet with you for a little bit. And now they're actually playing together. It's not two random people or the whole class suddenly playing their instruments. And yeah, it was
mm.
really fun.
Yeah, it sounds like really fun projects. Okay, this is more of a philosophical or just general conceptual question. Do you see that the goal of machine learning, incorporating that into music and creating new technologies, is the goal then to systematize somehow or develop a system that's kind of a predictable model? Because I feel like you have to take in so many factors and try to figure out common denominators, right? When you develop certain models for it to automatically do certain actions, just to overly simplify how I think AI. So, what do you think is the goal then for the technology of machine learning and music?
I think you're right on track actually with what you said. I I would categorize before we dive too far into that discussion that there are two different areas that I was working on with AI. One of them is making tools to facilitate musical performances. And at that point, this is where we're solving more objective problems. Where is the person looking? Who are they trying to talk to? Who are they pointing at? And with those, the goal is simply to enhance the capabilities that musicians already have and are exercising and just make it easier for them to use those capabilities.
Mm.
But then you brought up this other part of adding a mechanical quantitative judgment to things that are musical. And I would argue that that's not the goal, but it becomes a necessary byproduct sometimes. Because I think the goal of the people working in this field is to create beautiful music and to create music in the style of X, or music that is appropriate for this setting. And to do that, at some point there needs to be some form of evaluation, because otherwise it's really hard to say my model works, because what does works mean? And so I think that is the point where there is some byproduct of a mechanical judgment being inserted, but I don't think that's the ends that anyone is trying to reach. It's a means to an end of creating the music, but I don't think anyone's working to say how can we better impose a mechanical judgment on something that is so human. I hope that
Right,
makes
of
sense, and I
course.
hope I'm correct with.
No, that definitely makes sense, and it also shows a flaw in the way I phrased my query, because yes, it's not the end product, but the fact that you have to use this kind of quantitative model as a means to achieve that beautiful music, does that limit then the possibilities?
Oh, yes, yes. uh, yeah, I mean, any model is only as good as the data it has to train on and the cost function, the loss it uses to improve itself. So if we have something that says a music is only good if it's in the key of C major, that model will never deviate from C major. You'll never hit what it is you're actually trying to achieve. And I'm not saying anyone's training to be only output music in C major, but what we don't know or haven't experienced or can't write into an equation, we can't encode that. So
Mm.
we need creative minds to make new things and to come up with new ideas. Otherwise, these models that are trained on old data won't be able to do that.
So then
And
it's the data constantly revised in the contemporary times, or does it also take into all the historical performances of how people played music? Because there's been so many different changes in style of playing. Like back then, lots more wrong notes, for example, but there was a lot more spontaneity in style of playing,
yeah, yeah.
a lot more passion. And right now, I think in modern age, everything is super clean, and
Hmm.
sometimes there's a bit more restraint in expression of music. So then, how do you, yeah, decide on what data to
I
encapsulate your
I
model?
would love to talk about that for a moment. Actually, that's something really interesting to me. So I'm going to answer your question by posing a question back to you, if that's okay.
I love it.
What This is everyone's favorite question. What is music?
Oh, I love that question. Because have you read Hans Lick's on the Beautiful of Music?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Yeah, so when I first read that, for those who don't know, he basically argued that music is not emotions. And that was at least the takeaway in my first reading of this piece of writing. And he was trying to say basically that music is, well, he used the German term, but it's temporally moving forms, or something to that extent, as an English translation. And in a way, he was trying to argue that you can only understand music in musical terms and not really use other things like emotions and the impact it has on your emotions as a point of judgment to say this is a good music or not good music. And yeah, so then what is music?
Isn't
Sound?
that funny though? I feel like I would disagree with that definition now, because, like you kind of pointed out, we can make these perfectly mechanical representations of music. We can play a MIDI file. Is the MIDI file going to sound like the piano and have the same uh, understanding common to people? I don't want to hear a MIDI file play back a Schumann sonata. I want to hear Tiffany play it on a piano. And
Yeah, so Schumann, I love that you brought him in. But I was then okay, if I were to argue from Hanslick's point of view though, it's precisely because there isn't that sense of form, which form itself, it's a very philosophical, uh, also abstract concept of how do you sustain a form in music temporally. There are certain things, for example, when you play a phrase, you can play it very chopped up, or you can play it in one phrase and in the way you do legato, or in the way you, I don't know what the equivalent is in flute, so help me. But you do certain things, stylistic things, to sustain that attention and sustain that form, which I don't think a MIDI file playback can do, precisely because it is just very chopped up.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I wanted to get at here. We have a MIDI representation, which is arguably to some a perfect representation of the music. And that's one option, and that's just a list of instructions, right? Play this note for this duration with this intensity, then play this note.
That shows that it is only based on the definition that music is just made up of pitch and duration and in time,
Hmm,
right?
hmm. Right.
So that means there's a third element. So what is that? Or
And I
many
think
more elements.
I think that's the one that we get from these real performances where there's noise, there's deviations, there's things that aren't ideal in the sound. Even when you strike a piano key, depending on the climate of the room and how that's changing, that pitch, sure, it'll be almost 440 the whole time, but it might waver a little bit, and you're not going to get that in a MIDI file unless you manually add it. There is some random information added to a live performance. And so that's another representation we can take. And then the third beyond that we didn't even touch on yet is sheet music. And I think at this point, you would probably agree with me that it's more instructions on music at this point. It's suggestions, it's ideas, but it's not actually the music itself sometimes.
It depends, because it's still a very integral part of the existence of music in a very materialistic sense. Without sheet music,
Hmm.
back in the day, how do you play music of Beethoven today? So, uh, yeah, is the music then just the experience, the temporal experience, and does each instantiation of a sheet music score mean that it is part of that music? Like, yeah, I don't know what your take on the ontology of music is, but this is definitely very fascinating, and I can talk for hours, just going back and forth in a dialectic. But yeah, what are your
I agree that we have the same problem, that this is a almost unanswerable question that we'll talk about the whole time. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because with all these models we talked about that are going to output music, we have to give some kind of input to it. And depending on which input you choose, your output will vary. And so maybe you give an input of a piece of sheet music. And at that point, what modality are we using to read the sheet music? We're using our eyes, vision, a camera. If we give an audio file, like a MP3 of your latest performance, we're using our ears now. We're using sound as our function of data. And even with a MIDI file, that's something different altogether. That's a list of instructions. It's not sound, it's not sight, it's just a list of information. And so it's really interesting to pose to students starting in machine learning and music, uh, what information source are you working with? What are you considering music for your model? And you get these beautiful outputs either way, but they're different. If you're spitting out MIDI information versus spitting out audio information versus spitting out a new piece of sheet music, they're all generated differently, and they all have their own limitations that are worth thinking about. Even if we don't know which one is actually music, we've discussed here what limitations each one has in what it can convey, and always worth keeping in mind. And I think musicians have a really good, they have an informed response to that because they've lived a live performance. They've listened to a MIDI file, and they've found when they read their sheet music, sometimes they don't know what it means.
Yeah, sometimes I don't know what it means, but um, but that goes back to my original question of how do you decide which input?
It depends on what you want to create. It does. If you want to continue Schumann's or Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, maybe your input is going to be a MIDI file or the sheet music that you already have, and you're trying to generate guess the next note in a pattern. Like you mentioned, there's the idea of these motifs or patterns throughout time, temporal patterns, and you want to observe those. It's going to be a lot easier to observe a temporal pattern in the notes if you are given the notes to begin with instead of a sound file with all of the noise that comes with that and all of the uncertainty. So it depends on the problem you're trying to solve, and then you pick the right version of music for that day.
Interesting that you phrase it as a problem solving approach, because yes, when we learn as humans, because we have
Hmm.
to differentiate that in this conversation, as humans, when we
Yeah.
learn music, um, I don't think we think of it as really a problem to solve. I mean, technical aspects of a piece of music, sure, little issues that we have to figure out, or very big issues that we have to figure out technically, but overall, the music itself is not a problem to overcome, which it seems like you have to structure it that way for machine learning, just because it has to define somehow the set of values you take in for the input.
I that's something I'm going to have to reflect on a little bit because that that's a great takeaway for me from this conversation that maybe the word problem, while it fits with some engineering contexts, I don't think it fits very well with this musical generative situation because we're not really solving a problem with a defined answer. We're just creating things. Um, but y- the lingo of problem, of course, comes from all the other engineering problems we try to solve with machine learning. But I think you're right on this one. We need a better vocabulary that captures what we're doing, and we don't need to constrain it in such a way all the time.
Yeah, so I guess let's end on a futuristic note. Where do you see machine learning then, with all of these limitations that we talked about, and also the possible models that you can create and the many possibilities? Where do you see it going forward?
I think it's going to a place where everyone can have um, can participate in the same way, and I'm really excited about this. Amazon and Google are each creating their own version of deep learning applied to music. We have Amazon's Deep Composer, which is a keyboard that anyone can type a little melody on and have a machine learning model take it and go running. Google has their Magenta platform, where you can analyze music. They work more with the audio files that we mentioned, and they can help you visualize what your music looks like to a computer. And so I think we're reaching this really interesting space where musicians who play instruments and even musicians who don't play instruments just enjoy music are going to get a chance to see music from a different perspective than they usually do. They're going to get to see what
Mhm.
an audio file might look like visualized. They're going to see what a computer thinks should be the next pattern and why it thinks that way. And so I think we're going to reach this really exciting creative space where we better understand our art from new perspectives.
Ah, interesting. Because this is a very eye-opening conversation, because I always thought you have to limit yourself when it comes to making models in machine learning, because you have to define a certain set of input first, and then whatever that is, it's going to limit the possible outcomes. But from your way of speaking about it, it seems like it actually creates different perspectives that you wouldn't otherwise see had you not gone through that type of mediation, I guess. And yeah, that's very exciting, very
Yeah.
interesting.
hmm And if
Thank
I
you.
can, of course, this is so much fun to talk about. And there's one other interesting thing in the audio space that we talk about being inventive and creative in music. And um, inventing new sounds is just one other area that's starting to boom right now. So if you imagine you have your classic XY axis that we learned about in middle school when we were first starting with algebra. And
Mhm.
imagine you could plot the sound of a clarinet playing an A somewhere on that space. And then you plot a violin playing an A somewhere else in that space. What would happen if we were to try to then recreate a sound using the space in between? So if we reduce a clarinet making A to this point and a violin here, what happens when we pull this other sound and generate something new from it? And I don't know if we'd call it a
Mm.
cliolin or something else, but you can create these new sounds altogether that are combinations of orchestral timbres. And uh, I think we're going to have a lot of fun hearing new sounds and new compositions come from the next few years using these ideas.
Ah, that's very interesting. Because it's true, when you play music, usually it's at that point of playing. That's what you hear. It's not so much the interaction in the in between. I mean, yes, with contemporary composers, they play a lot with different ways of making that sound and making it less of just a straightforward, you play a note and the note comes out and that's what you hear as part of the music or as the music. So that's very
hmm
interesting. Thank
Yeah,
you. I learned a
of
lot.
course. I did too. This was a great discussion.
Well, that was a fascinating conversation. It definitely changed the way I look at machine learning and how it can actually open up more possibilities through this mediation model, even though that may start out with a limited set of data. It can also open up possibilities of music making that would not have been possible just through the usual human plays a note, music comes out model. So thank you very much for listening to this episode, and be sure to check out future and also previous episodes of Classical Chats on YouTube or on your streaming platform of choice for podcast. In the meantime, I look forward to the next conversation. Thank you.